Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special council meeting. We will be dealing with item number 1, then we will go in camera, and then we will actually come back after recessing from the in-camera to potentially deal with an item. I guess on the strategic and the customer service stuff, welcome, Janet. Oh, you're not lit up. You're not. You're not. Nobody's lit up. Is the system? Yeah, I can turn you on. Try clicking it again, Michael. Nope. Do you want to reboot it before we start? Okay, just give us a couple minutes. Oh, really?
Might be halfway through now.
So through you, Mr. Chair, we can certainly speak from the podium, and then after this presentation, we'll see if we can get it fixed for this evening. So thank you, Mr. Chair. As Council is aware, recently the organization underwent a comprehensive organizational review led by Mr. Chapman, and many of the findings were related to how we can improve customer service at the organization. You would also be aware that the new organizational structure that will be rolled out in the coming months is making a number of specific changes to specifically improve how we are delivering on our corporate customer service agenda. And while that work is very early days, today you're going to hear about some immediate actions we're committed to taking and have in fact already started to work on to move this agenda forward and to make improvements to the service that we're providing to customers. I can tell you that we are, as a staff team, a corporate customer service staff team, many of whom are here today to answer your questions later in the presentation, we are very excited to see the renewed focus that the city is going to be taking to customer service. And we're very committed to moving this work ahead faster than it has been moved in previous years. So we look forward to hearing your input. This is just the beginning, and I believe you are going to hear a lot of great things about our customer service work in the coming weeks and months. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jana Miller. Jana will be taking on the role of Director of our new Corporate Customer Service Division when the changes are in place in a few months. Thank you.
Thanks. Janet, you can go on to yours. I think the challenge is going to become when we get to the point of looking for council input, we're not going to have any mics. Like, ours aren't working at all. I can't even manually turn them on. So, is there a hard reset we should be doing? Let's do that. I think this is an important topic, okay. So let's do a hard reset. Sorry.
A little bit anticlimactic twice, but that's okay.
In the interest of good customer service, we want to make sure you have the opportunity to present appropriately.
I appreciate that. Yeah, everyone get in line, sing. Exactly. I know I was going to make a joke there. Yeah, just the other one.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for, are you good, Jeff? Okay. Good afternoon, Council. I'm pleased to be here today to host this strategy session about corporate customer service. As you know, customer service is the red thread that ties us all together at the City of Kitchener. No matter what our job is here, we're all in a service role. We have some exciting opportunities before us to improve our service to citizens so that they find it easier and more convenient to use. And we're excited to share with you some of the immediate initiatives on the horizon related to the city's customer service agenda. During today's session, you'll hear about how we're addressing the findings of the recent organizational review as they relate to customer service and the work we're doing to close the loop on customer service requests. I'll also share the details of the corporate customer service review that's just gotten underway. And finally, you'll have the opportunity to hear the results of the first phase of our community engagement for the review, a statistically representative survey of 600 Kitchener citizens that asks specific questions about their service experiences with us. As you know, we'd also like to hear your thoughts on a few specific questions we've outlined in the staff report, so I'll pause at those times to give you an opportunity to provide input. Additionally, because there's a lot of information to be shared, we've built a break into the presentation, but Council can decide when we get to that whether that's something you want to do. In January, after a comprehensive organizational review, a new structure for the city was introduced, which, as you know, will come into effect in the spring. Not surprisingly, given the city's daily focus on providing services to citizens, one of the themes we heard out of the review was related to enhancing the city's customer service delivery. For example, the review identified that there is a need to speed up the work we're doing on our corporate customer service strategy, to provide dedicated senior leadership to it, and to generally increase our capacity to move this work forward faster. Additionally, there is a need organizationally to better group related functions and services together under our departments. The actions we're taking as a result of the review build on our strengths as an organization, including our strong service culture. In the coming weeks, the City will address the review findings by putting a new organizational structure in place that focuses on improved service delivery to citizens. Some of the changes include realigning related services and functions under the departments and ensuring strong leadership is in place for each. For example, as part of the realigned structure, a new development services department will be established that brings together all of the city's development functions under one roof. And finally, to address the need to increase the pace of our customer service work overall, the City will create a new corporate customer service division, putting dedicated leadership and resources behind moving this important work forward. As you can see, there's a lot of text on this slide, so we've provided you each with a hard copy for easier viewing. At a high level, what we're trying to illustrate is that a key focus for the new division will be to shift our corporate approach to customer service from the responsive, issues-driven focus of today to an approach that is still responsive but is also strategic and proactive. What this means is that instead of focusing mostly on responding to citizen issues and complaints once they've already occurred, we will collect and analyze information about how our services are being used and how our customers feel about those service experiences in order to make improvement up front before we receive complaints. What we're talking about here is customer feedback data we'll be collecting about the experiences and satisfaction levels citizens have when using our individual services. And service data we'll collect and analyze about the thousands of service requests we receive annually that tell us how, where, when, and why citizens are accessing and using our services. Mining service data in this way will enable us to proactively bring the citizen's voice to the table more often to influence improvements we make to our services. And it will help us identify trends and patterns in how our services are being used so that we can proactively identify where improvements are needed. There are currently 4 corporate customer service related projects on the council-approved business plan. Our intent today is to focus on the first 2 projects on the list before you. While progress is underway on all 4, these 2 have some exciting and immediate actions that we want to share with council and gather your feedback on. Other business plan projects underway include the development of a new plan for moving the e-services agenda forward by the end of this year, and the expansion of the customer relationship management software into more areas of the organization, which has work underway on it now that will extend into 2019 and beyond. So back to closing the loop on closing the loop. We'll open up discussion about this in a few minutes, but you can see on the screen how we're defining the concept of closing the loop with citizens. It's about notification of the completion of a request and, if possible, sharing what was done to address it. We know that timely resolution of an issue drives customer satisfaction, but in order for it to be timely, citizens need to know when their issue was resolved. It's important to note that some work is already happening to provide closure on citizens' requests. For example, providing tracking numbers on service requests made by telephone, returning emails to citizens coming through the info@kitchener.ca address, responding directly to an increasing number of citizens who are making service requests through our social media channels, and ensuring consistent communication with citizens on escalated complaints. However, while work is already underway in some areas of the organization, we know this is not consistent across all services or all service channels. As you can imagine, with so many different services and service channels, there are many considerations we need to think about as we design solutions for closing the loop with citizens. I won't go through them all, but we've shared some of those considerations in the staff report. The most important one to note is that our services are unique, so closure notifications will not look the same in each case. While our goal will be for citizens to receive a consistent closure experience on each individual service, we know that some considerations, like privacy legislation, for example, will mean that the level of detail we can share within the closure notifications will vary. A good example is a property standards complaint, where information about direction an individual property owner may have been given can't be shared as the outcome of the service closure. So we could maybe share that it was closed, but we can't necessarily share what was done to close it because that information may violate privacy standards. Over the next 3 months, we'll launch a pilot project with a city service focusing on the implementation of an automatic email notification to citizens to advise, in all cases, that their specific request has been closed and, where appropriate, to advise them of the outcome. The pilot will be monitored for 6 months with the expectation that we'll learn from key issues and make needed revisions to it before expanding it to more city services within 12 months. The service selected for the pilot will be chosen for its robust, well-established business processes because having documented steps for how a service is performed is what ultimately ensures consistency for the citizens using that service. The selected pilot service will also be an area that receives a high volume of requests, as this enables us to build a representative data set so that we can understand trends in use, and because it gives us the opportunity to improve the service to many citizens at once. More comprehensive details about how we anticipate the pilot working can be found in the staff report. But overall, we believe that this project represents an important opportunity for service improvement, not only because it enables citizens to know their concern has been addressed, but because it also enables us to better communicate city's service standards to citizens so that they always know what they can expect. Once again, you'll see our working definition of closing the loop is back on the screen before you. Before we go any further, we know that you've heard from citizens on this issue, and we like to ensure that we're all on the same page about our definition of closure. Additionally, we'd like to know if you have suggestions for specific services where we could potentially pilot closure notifications. Before I open it to questions, I want to acknowledge that this pilot is largely the work of John Amsden, our customer service business analyst, who's in the audience today and is available to respond to questions if needed. Mr. Chair, at this time, I'd like to open it up to hear Council's feedback on the 2 questions before you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate all of the work that has gone into getting us to this point. This is something that has very much been a council priority and a senior management priority for some time, and so to see it moving forward and advancing is quite exciting. We do have some people in the queue, and so if I can ask people, maybe before we do the questions for council, I'll ask Councillor Fernandez and Councillor Davey, are you responding to these, or do you have questions of the presentation?
I have questions of the presentation.
Okay, we'll do questions of the presentation first, then. Go ahead, Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks. So, my first question is regarding the survey. Are we going to be discussing some of the outcomes of the survey and the perceptions as well today?
Yes.
That'll be coming up.
That's coming in a little bit, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I won't go to any of those questions. I guess my first, and I know that I've been hammering on the Pink Street thing a number of times in the past, but my thought was that was part of what we were doing with the closing the loop. Now I'm hearing that that we are piloting this. So has there been a misunderstanding or a gap, or what's happened with that original software? So that is software that we...
It's an app.
An app. Mm-hmm. Original app that we brought forward. Was there some kind of a gap in that?
So through the chair, the way Pink Street works, you're right, it's an app that's on your phone. Citizens have the opportunity to report a problem through the app. So that goes directly to our info@kitchener.ca email address, which is answered by staff in the corporate contact center. So they would receive a response that their request has been received. Do they receive it if it's addressed?
If there's an email address.
They get a response if there's an address?
Yes.
So if an email address is included, then they will get a response that their concern has been addressed. So that's one piece. I should have mentioned it as one of the successes that we're already having in terms of closure, but we're still using Pink Street. Citizens are still using Pink Street. In fact, report a problem is one of the highest reasons that they're using Pink Street.
So just a couple other questions. You said on page 1-5, you talked about the number of staff that were surveyed. 500 staff were surveyed. It would have been interesting to see 800 staff participating at this time of the report was written. I would have been interested to see, and maybe some of my colleagues, what was the perception? I mean, what's the uptake? For some staff, this will be a significant change in how we respond to things. To other, it will be what they've been wanting for a long, long time. So I think that would be very interesting for us to understand the percentages on something like that, because it's going to be up to the staff to say, this is how we want to see this moving forward, as well as council, as well as residents, because I think it's really a three-way partnership.
Ms. Miller, I think Mr. May wanted to jump in.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, maybe we weren't clear about the format of the presentation, but what we're hoping to get today, or right now, is questions on close the loop or general stuff already presented. Councillor Fernandez, that is related to the second half of the presentation, which is all about the customer review. So we're happy to answer that question, but just to be clear for other members of council, we're trying to divide the presentation into two halves. Okay.
Okay. This was under council questions in that part of the report, and that's why I included it in my questions. But I'll let Councillor Davey ask his questions of the report, and then we can go back to round table thing.
Councillor Davey, did you have questions of the report? You're replying to this, Councillor Ioannidis, questions or replies? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic, and thanks, Jana, for your presentation. I know this has been something I've been bugging you for a long time, so I'm so happy to see this here. I guess my one question would be in regards to with citizens when they respond to some of these questions. Are we going to collect the data and see why they respond to certain questions? Like, for example, as you know, there's a lot of things that the public will give us not a happy response because we couldn't do what we could do, whatever it is. Are we going to be able to quantify all that or evaluate that information?
This is more John's department than it is mine. He knows the specifics. It's his project.
Through the chair, we haven't designed the survey yet, but that's definitely something we'd be looking into. We want to value out of that survey and make sure that we're addressing their needs.
Okay, so let's say after every engagement with customers through this process, is there going to be like a follow-up email saying, how did we do? Can you rate how we did, and what can we do better?
Through the chair, absolutely. That's core to this pilot, is that they'll receive a survey. The intent, we still have to look into this a little bit more, but the intent is to know which service requests they're responding to on the survey about, so that we can correlate that information. But we do want to do that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I guess my other question is in regards to, I guess, privacy. And I know through some of the other tools that we use on council and stuff that we get information. How are we evaluating that? Like, how do we know? How do you know which is private? Because I know some of the information we get on our weekly updates, residents call in, and we don't even know who's called in. So I have a little bit of concern with that because they're calling our office, they're calling in particular to me, and I still don't know who's calling. So how are we going to manage this with this process?
So through the chair, in your case, in your office, the, residents are given the option of, do you want your counselor to be able to follow up with you on this request? I think the answer is largely yes to that question. So you could, if you needed to follow up on something, you could. Obviously, personal information like people's names, addresses, those kinds of things have privacy concerns around them. So as I mentioned, service closure will not look the same in every case. I think we're going to have to do some work with our privacy team here at the city to determine that on a case-by-case basis in terms of what we're allowed to, realistically say in terms of closure, in terms of how something was addressed. I gave the property standards as the example. Because we can't give out information publicly about individual property owners or their property. So that I was trying to be as clear as possible with that example, but I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I won't get into it, but I personally would like to have more information. I know whatever we can, because when we see those weekly updates, and I'm sure this correlates with this as well, just because we're better informed on who's contacting us in particular. I do respect the privacy so whatever we can do to manage that so we can be better informed.
I appreciate your comments.
Councillor Gazzola, do you have questions or replies to the two questions? Okay, go ahead, Councillor Gazzola.
You know, I'm just moving really slow. I'm just trying to understand. You're talking about setting up a new division, department. I'm just trying to understand where we're at right now. Where is the contact center? Who does that come under now?
I'm sorry, the contact center, what is the question?
Where is that? I'm looking at the organization chart. I'm trying to see how this new organization is going to fit in, but I don't see how the old one is. Where the old one is.
Mr. May?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the Corporate Contact Center currently reports up into the CAO's office. What we'll be doing is taking the Corporate Contact Center and putting it in a new corporate customer service division. And so there'll be some other positions. Jana Miller will be the director of that division, so that it won't just be the contact center. There'll be some other positions focused on things like e-services and project management and those kinds of things. So it is part of the overall reorganization that was announced a few weeks back.
Has that overall reorganization been distributed?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I believe that Mr. Chapman has done extensive communications internally to council and to staff about that reorganization.
So with this new division, you're saying there'll be no new heads. What other changes will there be?
So through you, Mr. Chair, it's all about focus and dedicated leadership. And so we're using existing headcount and existing dollars to put a team together that is going to be focused on driving this agenda forward. The reality is that for the past several years, this agenda has been part of other people's jobs who had other work to do. And so they weren't focused on this, and as a result, I think it's fair to say that we haven't moved this work forward as quickly as we'd like. And so it's about better utilizing existing resources to focus on this work.
Thank you.
Councillor Marsh, do you have a question? Are you responding? Responding? Okay, so I'll go to Councillor Davey next then.
Thank you. I'm just quickly echoing, I'm really happy to see this before us as well. I think this is one of the top areas that we really need to improve. To the first question, I would say that yes, it does. The definition does largely capture what we're hoping for in terms of closure. It's not really explicit in here, but the one thing that does worry me between the varying services that we have is making sure that we notify residents of the timelines of these things. So, for example, we fill potholes apparently sometimes within hours, which is understandable, but other times if we're pruning tree limbs, it could be weeks or months depending on the backlog and the number of staff we have. And I think residents are generally accepting of that, provided they know that it will get looked at some point in the future. So I think in terms of that closing of the loop, I think the first part too should be, before it actually gets closed, is to let them know when the service will be the expectation of completion. I'm not really overly concerned about number two in terms of which services we actually pilot. I do think perhaps pruning trees might be a good one, just because I know we are somewhat challenged in that area, just to give an idea of how that looks. The other one I would suggest as well, because it's topical, is potholes, and we do have some not legislative requirements, but we have some insurance-related requirements when it comes to the filling of potholes, and that sense is out there that we don't get to them quick enough, so I think it would be useful to have that data.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fernandez.
So to the first question, I think what's important, and I think I've heard this from some of my colleagues as well, is the what, why, how, and when an action has been taken. So sort of taking from journalism, the who, what, where, when, why. I think it's the same thing when somebody asks a question about a service being done. If we can fill every one of those W's and the H with with a response, you're going to have a much happier resident. And even if you have to say to them that it's confidential, there still could be a rationale around it's confidential because of the Privacy Act, because the address. Because I think what you might get from some residents is, well, I gave you the address of 236 Green Street, and why are you not telling me what's going on with 236 Green Street? And whoever lives there, I'm sorry, I just picked that out of the air. Yeah, I think, again, it's an explanation of why we can't tell you any further. It should never be just because, right? You know, nobody wants to hear just because. Suggestions, I'm thinking snow clearing, which has been a hot button item. Now that it's all melted, of course, it's not going to be a hot button item. Park maintenance as we go into the spring. Noise complaints, property standards, and possibly because we've had so much tree removal, tree replacement, and maybe specific to the EAB, because I think that's right now that's probably still on everybody's radar, and we have had a lot of tree removals, but not a lot of tree replacements yet.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. I'm excited about this. It looks great. I wanted to just share that, yes, this definition captures what I've heard, and I also think that included in that would be when a resident asks one area of the organization a question that's related to a different area of the organization, that then it would be good to know that the person receiving the request or the complaint or the idea, whatever it is, passed it along, and then I guess through privacy policies, we'd have to just ask permission on the first point of contact. I'm going to share your contact info, and they'll, okay, is that all right? Yes, all right. So then they can contact them so that it's not lost in the ether. Is that possible?
Mr. May?
Yeah.
You're clicking. You were on. You didn't want to be on? Okay, sorry.
Through the chair, in short, yes, that is possible.
Okay, that's the shortest answer. And then the other thing I was going to agree with Councillor Davey about the request for tree maintenance. That's a major issue because I think that our staff are inundated with repeat requests that keep coming back, and they're spending so much time calling back to say, yeah, we got it, we got your request the third time, but we still don't have resources to go there yet. So a date by which they can expect to see action, and then also I think in addition to that, rationale. If we explain to them why it might take 3 hours or why it might take a year, let's find out why. So then the same goes for property standards. A person might complain about weeds growing over the sidewalk, for example, at a certain address, and then they don't understand why it hasn't been dealt with a week later. So if the feedback doesn't breach confidentiality, but at least says something like, this is the number of days notice a person gets, and this is the date by which you can expect to see action, then it's more calming, I think, for people.
Thank you. Councillor Gazzola?
Yeah, I don't have any concerns. Any information, any feedback that can get back to our customers is great. So my question is this going to be a lot of work to do this?
Initially, the pilot shouldn't be a lot of work. What will be a lot of work is to sort of go service by service and be looking at case by case basis and expanding it across. So we will need to be looking at how we prioritize that. And I think you've all given some good suggestions here today that we can sort of take into account on for you and the kinds of things that you're hearing about.
My original question was going to be, why are we doing pilot services, why don't we just start a program of doing this with everything? Why? I mean, people have concerns, they've raised them. Shouldn't we be getting back to them? Or if it's not in this pilot program? I know when constituents come to me with problems, which they want to do quite often, you have to get back to them. You can't just leave it. So why aren't we just initiating a program where we're going to start doing this?
Mr. May?
Through you, Mr. Chair, what I think is important to remember is the number of services that we provide, the number of channels in which we provide them. So every service is probably offered through more than one channel, whether it's a walk-up counter, a phone call, or online, and the number of staff that we have. And so what I've come to learn is that the challenge is the need for consistency across all of those things. And so in order to do that, we need to have documented business processes in place so that whether you pick up the phone for a parking complaint or you log it online, the processes are in place to respond to your complaint. And that's the beauty of the CRM system and the need to expand it, which is a business plan project we aren't diving into deeply today. But the more areas of the organization that use our CRM system, the faster and more efficient and more consistent we'll be able to provide that response.
Did that answer my question?
Sorry?
I'm not clear.
Okay. Do you want to ask it differently, Councillor Gazzola, so that you can get...
I'm struggling with this. If a problem, and I don't like the word complaint, problems arise, questions arise, and if they come to us, they're assigned to somebody to deal with. Why doesn't that person that they're assigned to respond to the source of the problem? Respond to the person that's raised the issue?
So through you, Mr. Chair, there may be a difference here between a problem or complaint and a service request. So somebody calls us to go prune the trees, an example. What we're trying to do is put the infrastructure in place so that that response can be provided more efficiently so that staff can move on quicker to the next service request while customers still get, through an automated process, closure of their call.
Is that it? Okay. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this. I'm really happy to see this as well. A lot of other councillors have already mentioned things that I would like to mention as well. I do think this is a good definition. It captures what they're looking about in terms of closure. I found that in my dealing with citizens when they're calling about a concern or issue, that helping them manage their expectations. I think there's I call in, my tree needs to be pruned, so I've called in, and maybe their expectation is that it's done tomorrow. And I think if we do more educating and explaining that, okay, thank you, this is now on your list, we do different sections of the city at different times of the month, so yours will be looked after in 2 or 3 weeks. Them knowing that it will be looked after and having kind of a ballpark time, I think really is satisfying for most. A chance for us to kind of educate along in that response, not to make excuses, but to explain some of the stresses and demands that our staff and services are under would be helpful as well. But I think definitely getting back and saying, we acknowledge your concern, and it is now in the queue and will be worked on. I don't know if there's a chance to do updates on that. Sometimes when you place an order online, it says we've received your order is shipped, your order's in transit, that sort of thing. I don't know how far we can go on that. I do echo my fellow councillors' suggestions for pilots on boulevard trimming and park maintenance, things like the trail garbage cans in the parks being full. The other big one would be tree stumping and replacement, which has also been put out there. I do hope that as well that when we start this pilot, we can collect the data of where we're getting a lot of calls and concerns about, so maybe we can use that to direct more resources to these areas that are more, commonly called in. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Jana, this is just piggybacking on what Councillor Marsh was just getting at. My biggest problem, before I get into the biggest problem, I'm really glad to see this, but my question involves, I've had recent experience with a pseudo property standards delay of work episode. I've also had a fire in my ward that created all kinds of bad PR for the city. So people are concerned about properties where they complain about appearance of the property, scruffy property, but behind it there's often something else. In this case, building permits where the property owner has not gone ahead with the building permits. So that situation has existed for a long while. When people complain or point it out to me and I complain, I'm told, well, it's because exactly what I just described. But if I'm a resident and I'm looking at that week after week after week, I expect information to explain the whole picture to me, not just one that says it doesn't breach our property standards bylaw. Would this in fact do that? Would it provide the whole picture to that person who's upset? Or to a councillor who's upset?
So, through the chair, this process will not do that for the citizen who complains. We obviously have situations where councillors need to be involved because there's an issue in their ward. That's a different scenario than that, but we wouldn't be able to share that kind of information with citizens. But to many of the points that have been made around the table in terms of, explaining rationale for why, what we are giving you and why it's not more than that, that is absolutely the vision for what we're looking at doing.
A vision in the future?
Well, no, that's how we're going to start the pilot.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Marsh, do you have a follow-up, some follow-up responses?
Yeah, I wanted to address question number 2 in addition to what I've already said. So I also wanted to mention that I think an opportunity to pilot these this new process would be volunteers who have signed up for whether it's citizen committees or other opportunities but have not yet been engaged to close the feedback loop and after, let's say, 6 months or a year and say, hey, we haven't had an opportunity to get you in. Are you still interested? And here are some upcoming opportunities for you to get involved. And that way we keep them interested. And then another one was, I love how on Engage Kitchener platform we have the questions, the outcomes posted even after it's been closed. And so I was wondering if there would be an opportunity for posting information about results of our public engagement that didn't take place on Kitchener, on Engage Kitchener, but that would then just allow people who want to know, hey, I filled out an in-person survey or I answered questions at the market. Where's the results of that information? So I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
I just really wanted to give my input. I'm fine with the definition, and I stepped out for a couple of minutes, so I don't know if anybody suggested the pilot closure notifications with regards to snow removal. I don't know if that would be an opportunity, but I think you have to pick and choose to make sure that your pilot is a small enough group to make sure it's working properly. And so if that was one you didn't include, I'd be okay with it. But just one that I thought, and it might not follow your timeline of the next 6 months. But one that I think should be started sooner than maybe some of the others.
Any other feedback? Councillor Fernandez?
I think we're starting to do some of this already through planning, so this may not be something part of your pilot, but it might be something to consider. The number of public information sessions we have around development, around traffic calming, quite often you have, a whole slew of residents who come out to these meetings, but never understand what happens afterwards. So where is that decision going? And then how is that decision made? So let's just take, for example, a traffic calming or sidewalks. So people have come out, they've made their comments, and then staff takes that away and moves forward, and it comes to council for traffic calming. Sometimes I think it's not necessarily that information isn't sent back to those people who have attended the PIC to say, this is where it's going. Sure, it might be on the website that it's going to be at a committee meeting, but that's the middle of the day, and not everybody looks at the website, let's face it, as much as we would like that to happen. But we have their addresses, they always sign in, and I think that would be another avenue to get that engagement and that response to people. It may not be something that you want to do in the pilot, but I think it's something we should think about in the near future.
Thank you.
Okay, just adding a couple of my own thoughts. I do think, obviously, as much of this we can do as soon as possible is better. I think a lot of the specifics my colleagues have covered off in terms of the kind of calls. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me as we move forward with this is really identifying what in each area for all these types of complaints, what is our service standard? And then once we have that service standard defined, then that obviously becomes part of the feedback loop back to the resident. And through our CRM, if we're not meeting that objective, there's, threshold points that should kick in for us then to have additional follow-up. And, maybe, a pothole service standard is 2 days, but if it's pouring rain for 5 days, we can't, it's kind of hard to fill it because it's simply just going to wash away again. So there may be a rationale to do a follow-up email to that group of residents, for example, and have that as something that we consider going forward. And then obviously, let them know at the end of it, of the closure, and getting some sort of feedback loop back. And I think as Councillor Ioannidis suggested, where it isn't satisfactory in particular, or if it's particularly satisfactory, is there some additional language over and above, a simple score of 1 to 5 or whatever, where we could actually learn from that and data mine that going forward would, in my mind, be beneficial going forward. So with that, I don't see anybody else in the queue, so I'll turn it back to you, Ms. Miller, to continue on with the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your feedback. It's actually really good to hear your perspective and some of the points that you're bringing forward around managing citizen expectations, explaining the rationale for, what the information is that we're providing versus what we're not providing when it closes, and that whole ballpark around our service standards and what you might be able to expect in terms of what it typically takes to close one of these requests. Is good to hear because that is exactly the vision for the pilot. So it feels good to know that we're on the same page about that. I'll just take a couple of minutes to share the details of the work now that's underway on our corporate customer service review. As we get underway with the work of the new corporate customer service division, our first order of business is to fully understand where we're starting from. To do this, we've recently begun a comprehensive corporate customer service review. As you can see from the presentation template, our campaign is called Kitchener Wants to Serve You Right, with a call to action for citizens to tell us how we're doing. The review is expected to identify opportunities for service process improvements and best practices that we can leverage across the entire organization. To do this, we'll need to hear from citizens directly about their experiences and expectations when it comes to service delivery at the city. This work was started late last year with a statistically representative phone survey of Kitchener residents, and we'll be sharing the results of that survey with you later in the presentation. We'll also need to hear from staff in order to better understand our current customer service practices, and we need to understand what barriers there are to delivering great service and what red tape we can reduce to improve customers' experience. As you can see, the review is also intended to help us develop a corporate-wide customer service vision that will unite staff, as well as new service standards to define our expectations on service delivery. Lastly, it will help us develop a prioritized list of e-services that should be provided or improved on the city's website. This work will heavily influence the creation of the new plan for e-services that you'll see later this year. The internal portion of the review started 2 weeks ago with an online staff survey, and is scheduled to end in April. We had initially hoped to engage a minimum of 500 city staff representing all business lines using a survey, one-on-one interviews, and focus groups. I'm really pleased to say that the staff response to this work has been overwhelmingly positive, and more than 1,000 employees have completed the survey alone, which just closed last Friday. And we haven't got all the results in yet because we've got paper surveys coming still from some areas of the corporation. It's clear from this response that staff are excited to see us ramping up our focus on customer service at the corporate level. Throughout March and April, we'll conduct a series of stakeholder interviews with staff in all divisions. And during this time, we'll also reach out to members of council for your input through one-on-one meetings. In April, we'll be hosting a series of staff focus groups on such topics as our corporate customer service vision, reducing red tape, and what e-services we should focus on for better service. The goal of our community engagement for this review is to reach a broad cross-section of citizens and ask about their experiences, expectations, and desires when it comes to service delivery at the City of Kitchener. This will allow us to identify actionable opportunities. We've committed to engaging a minimum of 2,000 citizens through the review. In addition to the statistically representative phone survey we've already completed, we plan an extensive community engagement campaign that will allow us to engage citizens in several ways, largely by going to where they already are at summer events, outdoor pools, and city facilities. First, we'll provide an online survey supported by both a print and social media awareness campaign. The survey is expected to launch by mid-March and will be available to the public on our website through September. We'll also be deploying comment cards at all city service counters to gather just-in-time feedback about our service delivery. We've leveraged what we've learned from other successful engagement strategies like the neighborhood strategy to maximize the effectiveness of street teams to engage citizens. So throughout the campaign, we'll deploy these teams to events and festivals, city facilities, and outdoor pools to speak to citizens face-to-face. To make it as easy as possible for anyone to participate in the campaign, we'll also engage advisory committees, neighborhood associations, and cultural organizations, as well as set up a telephone line and a mailing address as additional ways comments can be provided. Finally, once we've gathered initial feedback from citizens, we'll expand the red tape reduction work that we started with the neighborhood strategy into customer service and host a series of red tape reduction workshops to identify opportunities to improve service delivery by striking a better balance between customer needs and government requirements. I should point out that all of this work I've just described to develop and execute both the staff and community engagement campaigns is largely the work of Christine Baker, our project manager. She's sitting behind me, who's also available to answer questions today if needed. So, Mr. Chair, at this point in the presentation, we'd like to share the results of the first phase of the community engagement. To do this, we'll be changing to another slide deck. So given that a lot of information has already been shared, this is where we built the break-in the presentation. It's up to council whether you'd like to do that or if there are further questions.
Okay, Councillor Marsh, you have a question on what's been presented thus far? Do you want to hold off till? Oh, okay. Folks want 5 minutes, or do you want to just continue on? Continue on? Okay, we'll continue on.
So I'd like to introduce Curtis Brown. You've seen him before. He is here to present our survey results.
Welcome, Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, councillors, Jana, for welcoming me here to present the results of this customer service survey to you. Of course, as elected officials, you are the ones who often hear from citizens about complaints, issues, problems that there may be with different city services. And so I'm actually very interested in your perspectives on how what we found through this statistically valid survey aligns with some of the things that you hear from your constituents on a daily basis. I'm going to explain a little bit just about how we did the survey and then get into some of the key results from it. We did the survey by telephone, which is typically how we do a lot of different surveys of Kitchener residents. We use a lot of different methodologies, of course, when we do market research, but this is the one for a survey of this nature that we will always recommend. And so it was a telephone survey of 600 residents that was conducted at the beginning of December last year. It was stratified. We made sure that we included both landlines and cell phones because we know that sometimes some people, they're harder to reach through, they don't necessarily answer they don't have a landline anymore, and then sometimes difficult to get them to do a survey. So we make sure that we have a certain percentage that are done by cell phone to make sure that we're giving everyone an equal opportunity to take part in the survey. So altogether, we ended up surveying 601 people altogether. We had quotas in place to make sure that the sample was balanced by different areas of the city and also by gender. We also do a little bit of statistical weighting by age because often younger people are less likely to do surveys. That's a very common technique for a survey such as this. And the margin of error on it, the statistical margin of error is plus or minus 4%. And this just gives you a bit of a idea of where we were, of what the sample looks like. Essentially, for surveys such as this, we typically cut the city into three, and so while talking at certain points in our analysis, we look at the northeast of the city versus the northwest versus the south. We have the wards there. That's how it breaks down in terms of how our sample is represented. We also include questions of gender identity, whether or not people identify as a visible minority, their level of education, those sorts of things, just to give you an idea of how the sample breaks down. And I can assure you it does look like a slice of Kitchener residents. I'm going to share the results with you a little bit backwards, if I may. The survey started out, we asked people mainly about whether they have accessed services and which channel or which means they use to access that service. And then later in the survey, we got into their satisfaction with that service, with the most recent service that they received, and then also asked them to agree or disagree with a number of statements about that service. I think the satisfaction piece and the attitudinal piece is really in many ways the meat of this survey and the really important part, I think, for you to see. So I'm going to start with it, and then I'm going to share with you some of the more details about which services people have accessed and how they've done so. So when we ask people about their overall satisfaction, we ask them essentially to think about the most recent service that they've received from the city and ask them to agree or disagree on a 4-point scale, whether they're very satisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, very dissatisfied. And when we look at it by the channels that people use, so this encompassed a number of different services, but we broke it down by whether or not they had used the website or some sort of online channel, whether they had called the city's contact center or whether they called the department or facility directly, or whether or not they'd accessed that service in person. And what I'm showing you here shows that essentially the number of people who are very and somewhat satisfied is actually very similar, and it's actually quite high across the board. So you see that 91% of people who access services in person, they're very or somewhat satisfied, and then 85% are satisfied depending on whether they use the contact center or whether they use the city website. The one thing to note about this kind of scale, we often end up reporting things in terms of the percentage that are satisfied, and as you see, it's quite high. The intensity of satisfaction is also important. So the number of people who say that they're very satisfied is also a critical measure for us. And we see it's fairly similar. We see it's a little bit lower for people who are using the website or online channels. But all in all, it is still quite high. And you see that it is highest there for people who access the contact center.
So this is the breakdown of satisfaction based on the different services that people accessed. So that top bar, that shows you the number of the overall satisfaction. 88% are satisfied altogether. That's the average, essentially. When we break that down and we look at the different services, most of these, I would caution you, we are talking about some of these were only accessed by very small numbers of people. So for example, you see down at the bottom, building permit, that's only 20 people. Statistically, that doesn't mean a great deal, but we thought it would be important for you to see what the comparison is. You see that overall, when we look at the percentage who are very or somewhat satisfied, it's pretty consistent. It's in the high 80s or low 90s, no matter what service we're talking about. Where it kind of breaks down a bit is on that intensity of satisfaction. People who've accessed or registered for a recreation program or a camp, that tended to be the thing that you had the highest percentage of people saying that they were very satisfied with. People dealing with Kitchener utilities for account setup or maintenance. You also had over 6 in 10 people of people saying they were very satisfied with that. Purchasing vehicle or bike parking, 60% very satisfied, 94% satisfied overall. And then we kind of go through it down there too, and we get to the lower end of the scale. Paying a utility or tax bill, you have 54% very satisfied. The small number of people who accessed the building permit saying that 49% were very satisfied. And then down at the bottom, 43% of people who paid a parking ticket were very satisfied. And we do see that the number of people there, the orange shows that the satisfied is a little high. Frankly, I don't know many people who really enjoy paying parking tickets, but I think it does, I think it does show that in terms of the actual service transaction, which is really what we're focusing on, people are still generally pretty happy with the services that they're receiving from the city. So from there, we asked people to agree or disagree with a series of statements about that most recent service transaction. So it's a 4-point scale, except instead of asking people about their satisfaction, we're asking just to what extent do they strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree with these different statements. And you see here, for the most part, again, most people agree with these. They certainly very strongly agree that staff that they dealt with were courteous and polite, that they were also treated fairly by staff. The method used to access the service was convenient. That score is quite high. Staff making every effort to address my needs. You have just over 80% of people agreeing with that and 57% strongly. I was provided a response within a reasonable amount of time. I was able to get what I required in a single interaction. Staff were knowledgeable. Those are all things. The lowest score on here is in terms of the overall agreement is 79%. And all of these, the rest of these are 80% in terms of overall agreement, and everything is over 50% in terms of strong agreement. We asked similar questions in other municipalities, and I can tell you that those scores are lower. These scores are actually higher. So it would seem that in terms of how people are assessing the service interaction with the City of Kitchener, Kitchener residents are quite happy, and they're certainly quite content with what with the service that they're agreeing, because they are agreeing with a lot of these different statements. We did find that people who actually accessed more city services tended to be more likely to agree with a lot of these different statements. They also tend to be more likely to be more satisfied. That may be because of familiarity with the city and its services, as opposed to someone who, say, is just paying a property tax bill or just doing kind of one thing and interacting with the city in a very limited fashion. That's what we end up seeing there. Now, so what we do with those two questions is we look at we look in the data and we conduct what's called a regression or a driver analysis to look at, of all of those statements that I just mentioned, where we're looking at to what extent do people agree or disagree with those statements, how does that actually impact people's satisfaction? So which of those variables, which of those things that affect the service transaction actually have a tangible effect on satisfaction? What's the relationship between those two things in the data? And sometimes when you do a regression or a driver satisfaction, you get a lot of different things will kind of explain overall satisfaction, but it doesn't necessarily, you don't really get a very clear picture. It can be a lot of different things can end up having a little bit of an impact. That's not the case here. What we see here is that there's one variable that really stands out as having a very strong relationship and has a very strong impact on satisfaction with city, the service that people receive. And that is that one statement that we ask people, city staff made every effort to address my needs. And from a customer service perspective, I think this makes a lot of sense. If you're seen to be addressing people's needs and doing everything you can to try to address those needs, that should have an impact in terms of how satisfied people are with the overall service. Even if it may not have gone completely to their liking, or they may not have got 100% what they want, making that effort should have a strong relationship with that. The other ones that are sort of, I would call secondary drivers, the relationship between those two things are weaker. It's weaker is city staff treated me fairly. I was able to get what I required in a single interaction, and the hours of service were convenient. They had a statistically significant relationship with overall satisfaction, but they didn't do a lot more to explain why people are satisfied. That one about making every effort to address customers' needs, that's the key thing. So I think that is, I think, really the key takeaway from this. And now I'm going to share with you just a few more details about how people access programs and services and which ones people have used in the past year. What this breaks down, so essentially, people are most likely to have visited or contacted a community center, pool, or arena. That's the way that people use services the most in the city. I'm going to talk about the second item there in a second about paying a property tax or utility bill. But registering for a recreation program or camp, you have about one quarter of Kitchener residents saying that they've done that. Paid a parking ticket or dealing with Kitchener utilities in some ways, mentioned by about 1 in 5 residents. Purchasing parking, mentioned by just over 1 in 10. You also have about 1 in 10 saying that they reported a property or a noise complaint, or they reported some other problem like graffiti or a pothole or litter or some issue that they're having in their neighborhood. And you have very small numbers of people saying that they applied for a building permit or they applied for a business or marriage license. Now, going back up to that light purple bar, 1 quarter of people have sort of interacted directly with the city to pay a property tax or utility bill, but the number of people who actually do that obviously is much higher. It's over 80%. But the difference is that most people who do that are doing that through their financial institution. They have something set up where they're paying for it online, or they're going in person to their bank or their credit union to pay those bills. For the most part, it tends to be people who are younger, more tech savvy perhaps, who are the ones who are more likely to be doing that. We have about a quarter of people who say that they're using the city's pre-authorized payment plan to pay those tax or utility bills. And then you have very small numbers of people who are either coming here to City Hall in person to pay, or either by paying the cashier or to put a check or put money in the drop box to pay those bills. When we look at the channels, we look at all those different services and which channels people use for what. Registering for a recreation program or camp is the thing that really stands out as being the highest in terms of what people are using online, going online for, or using the city's website, where they're using that for that purpose, although you still have about 3 in 10 who are doing that in person. Pardon me. You also have for people applying for a building permit or paying for a parking ticket, you have a slightly higher proportion of those folks did it online as opposed to doing it in person, although it's relatively even between the two. When we look at the channels that people are mainly using the telephone for, and again here we're making a distinction between ones where people would have contacted the facility or department directly versus where they would have been using the contact center. Making a property or a noise complaint or reporting a problem like graffiti or a pothole, those tend to be things that are more likely to go directly to the contact center. You have about, and then you have about 3 in 10 for made a property or noise complaint where they're contacting the department directly. Also, accessing services from Kitchener Utilities, that's something where people are more likely to do that and contact them directly. The one sort of caveat I guess I would have about some of these figures is that sometimes people, especially with calling, people's recollection of where actually they're calling. I mean, if they're calling the contact center, you may have some people who think that, if they have the direct number for that, that takes them directly to that department. So there may be a little bit of bleed over or confusion a little bit in the results. I think an important thing to keep in mind, and we don't know, we're relying on what people are recalling and what they're telling us. But I think this does tell you overall, this just gives you a good sense, at least overall. That's what people are using the phone for mainly. And then when we're looking at it in person, it's pretty clear that for things like going to a recreation facility, obviously more people are going to do that in person, although you still get a number of people who would have gone online to learn about what's happening at a recreation facility in the city. Purchasing parking is something that people are predominantly doing in person, and then the very, very, very small number of people, all 9 of them, who applied for a business or marriage license, said that they were doing that in person. Typically what we found is in terms of website usage, it tended to be more people who were younger, in that 35 to 54 age bracket, were more likely to be using the website for different things. And then in person, it tended to be more older adults that were doing that. So this just breaks down total channel usage. So as you see, in person, even though the website is important and that will likely be increasingly important in the future, it's still only accounts for 28% of the interactions that people would have had in the past year. In person still stands out as being the highest at 42%. And then we have about a quarter altogether with the telephone, and there's a breakdown between contacting the department or the facility directly or the contact center. And the other thing, of course, to keep in mind with the contact center, even though it only accounts for 10% and obviously does get a lot of calls to it, a lot of volume, it doesn't include quite as many. It doesn't include quite as many services, and there are a lot of services that people will go directly to different departments or different organizations for. When we ask people, this was an open-ended question, and so this just captures their raw responses essentially. We asked people why they didn't use the city website for basically anyone who didn't use the website for whatever reason. And the main reason that people point to is that they prefer to talk to an actual person. And so that's the one that really stands out as being the highest. You also have about 14% who say that they're not comfortable using technology or using computers. 13% who said there was no need or not necessary, or in this case that would include maybe cases of you're going to an arena. Well, obviously that's not really applicable. You have 12% of people saying they weren't aware that particular service wasn't available online, and that tended to be a little higher among younger adults. And then also you have 5% of people, including a higher percentage of older Kitchener residents, who say that they didn't have internet access or no computer, and that's why they didn't access the service online. So that gives you a taste of how people use services and which services they're using in the city. In terms of what I take from this, I think there are sort of a few key things that really kind of come to mind. I think really, as I say, as you saw, you do see that still in person is very important. And it still is, even though online is an important component and will likely be a growing component in the future, there are certain groups of people in the city who will still require in-person services, will require telephone services, and all of those things, and even online services, have to really include a human touch. And have, again, if people are not using the website because they want to talk to a real person, that's their preference, there has to be that human touch, that human element should really be a key part of it. As I mentioned, the satisfaction scores, I think you should, as a city, should be very proud that the satisfaction scores and the percentage of people agreeing tends to be higher than what I see in other municipalities. So that is a really positive reflection of what you're doing as a city from a customer service perspective. I guess a future goal may be to try to increase the percentage of people who are very satisfied. And then, as I say, working to meet people's needs really is the key driver of satisfaction. That may not necessarily mean giving people everything that they want. I think, as you alluded to, Councillor Schneider, it's about managing people's expectations to a certain extent. But really, that is going to be the key thing. If you're looking to improve overall satisfaction scores in the future, trying to meet those needs, showing that you're meeting those needs, closing the loop, those are the sorts of things that will really have an impact in terms of increasing that overall satisfaction scores. So thank you very much for allowing me to share that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, thank you for that presentation, and it's certainly it's very informative, but B, it's also encouraging, but it's also in terms of the results. But it also, I think, sets the foundation upon which we can build going forward as a municipality. And I know, a couple times a year when I get to talk to all of our sort of manager and ups or supervisor and up group at the city, one of the things I often talk about is sort of the importance of, people many times in their lifetimes only have a couple interactions with the municipality, and if we can make that a positive experience, it just really sets the tone in terms of their view of local government and the services they receive and so on. And if we don't, it creates additional challenges, and clearly we're doing some things right and just need to strive to take it to the next level now. Number of questions for you. Councillor Marsh, you're first in the queue.
Okay, thank you. So just a couple questions. First of all, I was wondering, how long did the survey take overall, generally, when the phone call was made? Was it a 15-minute survey, 20-minute?
It was just over 10 minutes, I believe.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
And so when you shared your results, you combined the two least answered results, so somewhat dissatisfied and somewhat and very dissatisfied. Can you help us understand why you did that?
Yeah, the reason we did that is mostly just to show is for the visual aspect of it. It becomes really ugly when we kind of break it down. There's a lot of like 2%, 3%. As you saw here, the number of people who are sort of saying either somewhat dissatisfied or very dissatisfied is quite low.
Yes.
And so that's why we just kind of put it together, just kind of for simplicity's sake.
So you did, and maybe we could go back to one of those slides. I recall that some of them are maybe 2% combined, and that makes sense. But if it's 12% or 16%, or that's valuable information to me, because yes, we have very positive results, and let's not forget that. But if the percentage of those saying very dissatisfied is 10% or more, or even 5% or more, perhaps one of our goals can not only be to move the results towards very satisfied, but also to decrease the number of very dissatisfied customers to a goal. So I think that when you're sharing those results with our staff, that should be broken down distinctly. Yeah.
We certainly have that. I mean, we have the data that this presentation is based on, and it does have the breakdown between somewhat and very. So we can share that.
Yeah. So we don't want to hide away from those who are super upset, and then let's dig a little deeper, right?
Sure.
Okay. And then what I wanted to know also is. It may be a question for Ms. Miller, so maybe I should cue back. I'm not sure. Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, I just have one question, and then I have a number of questions for Jana. My one question is how do we compare to other groups that you've done a similar type survey, groups or municipalities?
Through you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, some of these questions are actually standard in a lot of some of our other municipal research that we do. So I manage some other studies for municipalities directly, and some of these are very similar in terms of how we ask these, or in some cases the same. And as I mentioned, in a lot of cases, when it came to a lot of, especially on the agreement metrics, like staff treated me fairly, staff were courteous, some of those sorts of things, Kitchener ended up performing better than what some of the other municipalities in Ontario where I do this work.
I didn't see too many alarming numbers. Was there anything from your research with other groups that we were a little bit low on or we could focus on?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, not that I saw. There wasn't anything that really particularly stood out as being alarming. All in all, I think this was a very positive story for the city in terms of how you're performing in terms of perceptions of customer service among citizens.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions, but I do have questions for Jana.
Okay, we'll come back to those. Councillor Yanetsky.
Yeah, thank you for your survey. It's very enlightening, and I appreciate all the information that's in there. It's good to see that the customer service that we are providing is very, very good, up in the 80% category, as you pointed out in the various sections, and the quality of service, et cetera, as you've outlined there, is quite high as well. I've always thought that we did provide good service, and I really didn't know how we compared to other municipalities, other than what you just suggested, that you're up at the top quite a bit. Being where we are at 80 to 90%, and a couple of categories in the 90s, I find it very, very maybe difficult to try to make it even better in terms of an improvement. I mean, we'll never get to 100%. Unless you only take one survey of one person, he's totally satisfied. But I find that it's going to be rather a challenge. Do you see us, in terms of what we're trying to implement, improving these figures even more, or will it just be a negligible increase?
Thank you for the question, through you, Mr. Chair. That is a very good point, and I do think that, yes, when you take the number of very and somewhat satisfied, it's going to be very difficult to get much above the 90% mark. Once, in any survey, once you kind of get to that level, you usually tend to stay at that level, and you may go up or down a little bit. And that's why, like I say, focusing on trying to improve the very satisfied, the intensity of satisfaction. So if someone who has was somewhat satisfied with the experience, was kind of like it was okay, trying to get from that to it was a great, so I'm very satisfied. I think that has to be the goal, because that's probably where you will see movement. Whereas when you combine those two groups of people together, you're probably not going to see much more growth in that regard.
Right. Okay, appreciate that answer. Then the other way of communicating with the public, and you've had them, the contact center, going through the website, coming in person, dealing over the phone or emails or whatever. Are we trying to go in a particular direction? I mean, as technology approves, and if you did the survey 30 years ago, I mean, we wouldn't have maybe websites and emails or even further. So we moved in a different direction. Are we headed to eliminate one of these sources in the long run, or are we intended to use all of them just for customer service?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's not a question I can answer.
Mr. May, you want to jump in there?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's a really good question, and it's a key message perhaps we need to stress stronger. No, what we're trying to do is ensure that customers' experience, no matter if they use the website, the phone, or walk into one of our facilities, is a positive one, and they get the same level of service. So we will continue, always, even with the growth in the website and online service requests, we will always focus just as much on the phone calls and the walk-ins.
Okay. And one final question then, on people using a website, how are you able to track whether their customer satisfied and stuff of that nature, or I'm not too sure how that would be analyzed?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in this case, we're asking people based on which service they recall using. We don't have a direct measure of satisfaction, obviously, through whether or not they directly were in the website and when, but we're just asking them, how did you use it, and then how satisfied, and then looking at the analysis based on what their response were. And of course, memory is imperfect, but that's essentially how we're measuring that.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that answer. Thank you very much.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Vivanovic. Thanks again for this research. It's pure gold to me. In your experience, when it comes to the use of the contact center, would you say that is something our citizens use for something that's like pretty immediate, like reporting a pothole on the street or a street light is out or something like that?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. That would seem to be what the data suggests through this, that it seems to be things like, as you saw, it was for those two things in particular that the contact center really stood out, but you did see that people did recall the contact center for a number of other services as well.
Okay. And also, as I look at the areas where there was a higher level of dissatisfaction, I think you and I were discussing this in a previous question. It seems those are areas like, for a parking ticket or a property noise complaint, that maybe that's a case where we can't give that citizen absolutely everything they want. So if they're disputing a parking ticket and after we've investigated, they still get the ticket, they're going to be dissatisfied. So maybe that's not a service issue on our end. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. That's something that we were having a discussion about this the other day. And I do think that, in this case, we're trying to specifically isolate how people feel about the transaction itself and whether or not they're satisfied with that. And I think when you do see some of these, for example, like purporting a property or noise complaint or paying a parking ticket, that's where the dissatisfaction was higher. I think it's difficult sometimes for people when they're thinking about that interaction to decouple how they feel about what they were getting with the actual service that they receive. I mean, you could have stellar service and have people be really responsive, but at the same time, if the fact that you're making that complaint and you weren't totally happy with the outcome, or the fact that you're paying a parking ticket and you're annoyed by it, that may color how you score this on the scale, right? And so yes, I do think that you may see dissatisfaction just always consistently be a little bit higher on those things, because they're not, frankly, they're not happy transactions compared to, say, registering your kids for camp. So yeah, that is a very good point.
Wondering too if you have maybe any insight on how lifestyle affects the way that we engage or contact the city. Like, for example, I've received emails, late in the evening, and when you respond the next day, you say, sorry, I didn't see it last night, I'm responding now. And they're like, well, that's okay. We finally got the kids to bed, and this was the first chance I had to look into a particular issue. So with all the ways that we have to for citizens to contact, does that, I don't know if there's any idea of how lifestyle plays into what form they use to contact the city?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, we did see, as I mentioned, we noticed that it tended to be people who were younger, who had children. They were some of the ones who were more inclined to use the city website, whereas it was more older folks, people without children at home, who were more likely to be using, say, in-person or online methods. That's something that we found fairly consistently throughout the data. And it's something that we do see in a lot of other research as well for other municipalities and even in other contexts where that is often the case. To the point about lifestyle specifically and sort of, when people are able to do some of these things or when they like to be able to do some of these things, we didn't see, I can't sort of comment specifically on that, but we do definitely see that there are some key differences depending on certainly which life stage you're at or what's happening in your life in terms of how you are contacting the city.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Marsh.
A second round?
Oh, sorry, no, then I'll come back to you. Councillor Galloway. Your staff or second round? Councillor Galloway-Seelock?
No, sorry, I'm staff.
Your staff, okay.
Sorry, I'm staff.
Yeah.
Okay, then Councillor Fernandez, questions for the delegation?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I just lost my track of thought. One of the things that I think would be interesting is what is the perception of red tape, right? Because there's the red tape in terms of, when we were talking about engagement earlier, and then one of the comments in the report was around people's concern about red tape. So was there anything, whether it was anecdotal, there it is on page 1.1-5, a prioritized list of city processes red tape that needs to be improved to create a more positive experience for the customer. Do we have an understanding, because there's different red tape perceptions. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Through you, Mr. Chair, we didn't explore that specifically in the survey. We were trying to focus more on just people's overall satisfaction with the different services in general.
So I'm just guessing, but is it possible that when citizens send out a request for a concern or they register a concern, that if they're passed through a number of different departments, or how long the response is, that they figure, oh, well, they're just caught up in the red tape. Would that be a reasonable? Did you take any anecdotal evidence at all through your survey?
Yeah, could you please?
Through the chair, I'll just help answer this question. I think Councillor Fernandez's question is a good one, because I think there could be different perceptions of what red tape is. There's certainly the perception that you've just described, and there's also the perception of city processes that are broken or are pain points for citizens and that kind of thing. That really is the focus of the work that we're going to be doing, is to understand what citizens, what processes and things like that are pain points for citizens, drilling down into that, and that really is part of the second phase of our engagement. So when we go out this summer to talk to citizens, those are some of the things we'll be drilling down into more.
Right. Okay, thanks. I think that it was interesting when you said that it's important to recognize the intensity of the very satisfied, because certainly if you look at and break it down to the somewhat satisfied, very dissatisfied, on the website it was 48% of that whole group were either somewhat dissatisfied, somewhat satisfied, very dissatisfied. How do you take those numbers? I mean, we had a lower percentage on very satisfied on this particular one, but even when I went through a bunch of other ones, some of them were pretty close in percentages. 44, 46% on number 7, page 7, around please indicate if you strongly agree, disagree with access to services. How do you, and I know that one of my colleagues talked about, moving that needle more to and lessening the somewhat agree and strongly somewhat agree. Is that going to be the focus to get to where we want for service experience?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Fernandez, yes. I think that's what, essentially, as I was saying, I think that's where there may be the potential for future movement in terms of increasing overall satisfaction. Typically when we report these results, we kind of show them we take the very and somewhat satisfied and we add them together, and that gives us an indicator, and we look for the patterns within that to see kind of how that falls out for each of these different areas or different questions or whatever the case may be. And so in this case, since we're combining those, and you have all the very and somewhat satisfied, or the strongly agree and the somewhat agree together, and it almost constitutes the entire universe of people, those numbers probably won't go up very much. But if the focus becomes, if the goal for improvement becomes then increasing the number of people who are very satisfied, or the number of people who strongly agree that they were treated fairly, for instance, I think that's where any kind of service improvements, that's where you may see that start to improve, is in, again, that intensity piece where that will happen.
Just a question on the profile of the respondents. 35% of them had children at home. 65% did not. Is that really reflective of our community? Because I would have thought it would be much, much higher. And I'm a little bit concerned if that kind of, your responses are going to be significantly different if you're dealing with people that have families and children.
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Chair, to that. Certainly that's something, it is, I believe, a little bit lower than what it is overall. There's always, of course, a little bit of a range with a survey, an allowable range, and as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes it is more difficult to get younger adults to respond to the survey, or families with children and that sort of thing. So it probably is slightly lower than what is actually reality, but it is a fairly fair. If you take all of the people aged 18 and over in the city, you do have a number of people who are, say, 18 to 30 who probably don't have children at home. You also have people at the upper end whose children have moved out, or they never had children. So no, I'm confident in the representativeness of it. That's probably a little bit lower than what it should be, but it is still very representative.
You also talked about it is very dependent, I think, on a resident's attitude, right? Staff can be very courteous and respectful through the whole process, but if they're angry and ticked off about something, it won't matter what we ask, what we say to them after that experience. They're going to be saying, I didn't get the answer I wanted. And that must be very difficult to show in a survey of this kind.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that can certainly, it is all people's attitudes, and perception often is reality, and sometimes that can end up having an impact on how people feel about things and how they'll end up responding to the question.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, are we answering the question on page 1-6 now, or was this just general comments around the survey and questions?
We're asking questions of the delegation now.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, there don't appear to be any further ones. I just have one. And when we look at because I think overall, as you've mentioned and others have, our scores are very good. In the areas where the number is a little higher, i.e. over 10% of very or somewhat dissatisfied, is that in a range that's similar with other municipalities, i.e. the parking ticket one and the noise enforcement one? I mean, is ours 16 and theirs is 5 or some different number like that? Or are we kind of in the same ballpark?
I would be very hesitant. I don't know 100% for sure, to be totally honest with you. The thing is, with some of those things, like usually when I talk about that, I was sort of talking about overall satisfaction. In this case, we asked about specific different services. And the one thing I really would be, sort of caution on is the fact that because of those numbers, because we're talking about such small numbers of people, with that, I would be a little bit concerned, about making sort of a direct comparison in terms of what that looks like municipality by municipality. But certainly, I guess, to the point I was making before, it's the overall satisfaction and also just those other agree-disagree statements. That's where we tend to see the city performing relatively well compared to other municipalities.
For sure, and I'm very encouraged by that. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the presentation and your answering of all the questions.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we'll now move back to some questions that folks have for Ms. Miller. Did you have sort of any wrap-up comments you want to make before we take any final questions, or?
Yes, I just wanted to say that we are almost finished, and I was hoping just to introduce the question on the screen to council before I take your questions, just so that it's before you, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. So the question really is, now that you've seen the results of our initial citizen engagement, are there questions that you would like us to ask citizens as we go through the public consultation this spring and summer?
Okay, great. So I will now, what I'll do is I'll have people both ask you any questions that they have, but because I'm cognizant of time and we have some items in camera as well, that during their 5-minute time slot, they also respond if they wish to your particular question. And we'll start with Councillor Marsh.
Okay, so I just want to ask quickly then, if we don't have a lot of time, but maybe we can take the conversation further later. Your Kitchener, Your Say, is that happening this year?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so will that be at all coordinated with engagement so that we don't exhaust the residents, or are we anticipating those will be two separate processes?
Through the chair, those will be two separate processes. The timing is slightly off for both of them, so we won't overlap too much in terms of, citizen fatigue, in terms of how much they participate and answer our questions.
Yeah, and there's lots of citizens, so we can have different people answering different things. So, okay, so then I'm glad to hear that. That's really good. It sounds like we have a lot of good information from this initial survey. Are you thinking that you might have quite a lot of information to get started on the strategy already, or are there, what else are you looking to find out with the...
So through the chair, the embryonic survey that you just saw really is the jumping off point for us in terms of, yes, we do have a lot of good information about how citizens feel about coming to us, but there are definitely some pieces in there that we need to dig deeper on, and some of them were alluded to as you discussed it around the table, but even just in terms of the main driver of satisfaction being that staff have done everything they can to fully address your needs. we need to understand what things like that look like to a citizen, right? So how do we improve it? I want to understand what does that mean to you? What did we actually do? What would help make that better, that kind of thing. So that is a bit of a jumping off point, and we won't build the strategy until we have heard from citizens, because this whole thing is really about building it from citizens' perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, one of my questions, just with regards to, it's a little broad when we come to the topic of the customer service review. With our new program, that's one of the program software active. I know that one of the concerns was always the wait times at the beginning of registration, that people couldn't get online and they were quite frustrated, and so it was a problem from a customer service perspective. Right. Is that something that's looking to be addressed through the customer service review, or because I haven't heard if the new program registration system has solved that problem or not?
Mr. May?
So through you, Mr. Chair, right off the top of my head, I can say, like any system implementation, we had some bumps early on, but it is a much better system than previous. No, I don't think that's the kind of thing that would be captured through the review, but if you remember the handout with the 3 bars, it's a perfect example where we can be collecting data right now about customer satisfaction with our new software, and we're not. And so what we want to get to is a place where we are, and then looking at where are the problems and going and fixing them.
Okay, good. I guess the rest is more of just feedback with regards to the question. I was thinking the next time we go around is more of an open-ended question about what can we do better. I think you got a lot of really good data this time, but diving in a little more into what we can and how we can do better. And then also asking how, not that I want everyone to use online, but how do we focus a little bit more of our attention to customer service online with our online, our various programs that we have there, because that seemed pretty low to me, that with regard to how many people were actually accessing information and using the online versions of our customer service. And so more questions around even just asking if they know about Ping Street or Engage Kitchener or different things like that, to understand how we better can service people online versus in person, because it seems like we're doing a really good job in person. So how do we beef that other area up? I think that's all my input.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fernandez.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I think we could touch on is sort of flipping the question, because we always ask them about a positive, where were you satisfied? Sometimes it's good to flip the question and say, where were you dissatisfied? What were some of your frustrations? How many contact people did you have to go through to get the response you wanted to get? The other thing I wrote down was, so we've looked at service experience around reasonable amount of time and single interaction. I think that would cover the two questions I just suggested. It's hard to ask certain questions from people without, getting a long litany of, reasons what they don't like and what they do like. But maybe you could have an anecdotal question that related around a positive experience they had. And I know anecdotal is very difficult to put into survey results, but if we've already asked them where their frustrations were, at some point we maybe want to also ask them, where was your positive experience? Tell us something about your positive experience. What made that a positive experience?
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Brbanovic. When we get to those cases where we can't give the customer what they're asking for, maybe we could ask, what does it take for you to be satisfied with the service or response you were given? And also, adding on to that, if our limitations don't allow us to fulfill your request as completely as you'd like, could you still be satisfied with the effort given to try? Something in that area.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. I think mine's somewhat been covered, but I do have a concern when this comes back. I'm just concerned about, the whole new part about closing the loop and providing the human touch on this, is that it could come at a resourcing cost in terms of how many people we have to implement this. So I think I would ask the same sort of question in terms of those people that are hesitant to use our e-services, instead of just saying, why they prefer to talk to a person, why? Like, what is it that the person is doing that our e-services are not? Because in the fullness of time, I think we need to go down that road for efficiency and cost-saving reasons.
Okay, that appears to be all the people in the queue, Ms. Miller. I think some of the points I was going to raise have certainly been covered off. I'm intrigued in particular by the primarily in-person channel and some of the results. And when it comes to marriage and business license, I'm not totally surprised by it, because it requires you to bring your birth certificate in and so on. Business licenses require signatures from other authorities. So unless we have a mechanism to automate that, I would think that would continue to be an in-person kind of thing. Similarly with rec facilities, I mean, that's a bit of a different one. But the parking, I'm wondering, I imagine that purchasing parking is in person because somebody needs to get a transponder or a pass. But what's our process, for example, to do we offer to courier it out to them or mail them to them, or do we charge them for that? And that may impact on how people are using that service, and that's something we might want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of one that we might be able to transition. I think the other thing that would be intriguing for me is some of the things that people do come in for. Are they things that they have to come into City Hall for, and could they be delivered at our community centers and other facilities as a way of sort of making it, delivering that service closer to their home so that they could walk there, cycle there, or whatever, as opposed to driving downtown. So that's something I'd be interested in digging a little deeper in. So with that, I think that's everything. Do you have any final comments you want to make?
No, other than just to thank council for your input today. It was all very valuable, and even in this case, as well as with Close the Loop, we heard several things, I think, around the horseshoe that we are also thinking about, so that's encouraging that we're on the same page, and we just look forward to sharing the results of this work and other initiatives with you in the future.
Wonderful. And I want to just thank both you and the rest of the staff team, as well as Environics, for the work that's been done. I mean, it's been very informative. We're clearly making some great progress with a lot of exciting stuff coming forward during the balance of this term and continuing on into the next, and look forward to seeing the results of what comes forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll now take a motion to move in camera. Councillor Ioannidis, Councillor Fernandez. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to recess. Okay, I'll call the special council meeting that we recessed earlier back to order. Well, I'm just waiting for Ms. Marsh, Councillor Marsh, rather. Councillor Marsh. I think you're in the queue. Okay. Go ahead.
I'd like to bring forward a motion that the CAO be authorized to submit a non-binding expression of interest to the Waterloo Catholic District School Board regarding 91 Moore Avenue due to its adjacency to the city's Mount Hope Cemetery. Said expression of interest, to allow the city time to perform its due diligence, and said expression of interest to be satisfactory to the city solicitor.
Okay, we'll ask the clerk to put it up on the screen. Is there a seconder to the motion? Councillor Fernandez? Any discussion? If not, recorded vote has been requested. And that is carried unanimously. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Schneider, Councillor Yanetsky, all those in favor. Opposed, that's carried. And we'll start back again in 10 minutes.
Barry. Thanks. So we have all these two anyway.
So he's on car share, right?
Yeah, so